This is Talk is Sheep, a podcast by the Wild Sheep Society of British Columbia. Come along as we take conversations that matter to you into the high alpine.
Stephen, how are you, my friend?
Well, I'm not jet lagged. Can that even happen on something that's in the same time zone?
Yeah.
How was Sheep Show?
Well, I am not jet lagged, but I am bloody tired. Sheep Week was Sheep Week, man.
Oh, yeah.
You've been there. It was off the hook. It was, it was a bit wonky with COVID. Like things weren't normal, but there was so much energy, man. Like, and everyone was amped. They were happy to be there. We're seeing friends we haven't seen for 2 years. It was a beautiful thing. It was just a fun week. We made a lot of money for wild sheep. There's so many passionate conservationists out there that want to help the resource. And we've seen it first and foremost at Sheep Week. People were there. They opened their wallets. They supported the foundation. And it was really, really exciting.
Yeah, I saw that there was some records set. Like, what did Oregon go for? Something like 320 or something?
Yeah, it was
like
big
holy
dollars.
Yeah, it was. And it's important to remember and recognize that every single dollar from those tags goes right back to the resource. There's no administrative fees or anything like that. It's just it's out of government hands. It goes right back onto the ground. So those people that are buying those tags, we're truly thankful for, because as I said, it's directly to the sheep and the habitat that they inhabit. So it's a great time, and it's probably a good thing that I didn't get down there, right? Because my itinerary coming back, I would be stuck in Salt Lake City. They had me going Reno, Salt Lake City, Seattle, Vancouver, PG, and I got the itinerary sent to me after I should have landed in Salt Lake City, and said every single flight from there would have been canceled on me. So who knows? I'd probably still be living in the airport. What's that movie there where the guy's stuck in the airport for like 15 years? That would just
Terminal.
Right.
Oh,
that'd be the story of my life, right? I'd be trying to record a podcast and edit it from my new home in the airport. But yeah, on to bigger and better things. So that's awesome. I'm glad you had a good time. Looked like a good time.
Yeah, no, it was a great show. So on that note, one of the awards on the awards night on the Saturday night is the Frank Galata Award, the Outstanding Outfitter Award. And this year it was very cool. A good friend of ours, great support of the Wild Sheep Society of BC. The RT family, Jacob RT, was on the stage. He was receiving the award. Sierra El Alamo won the Frank Galata Award this year.
That's amazing.
For those that don't know, we have our WSR, our Wild Sheep raffles, and there's a Desert Bighorn with Sierra El Alamo on there. So you're going to be, whoever wins that raffle to go on a Desert Bighorn sheep hunt is going to be hunting with the Frank Galata Award winner from this year. The highest recognition you can get from the Wild Sheep family for the guide outfitters, and just a huge congratulations to the RT family, to Jacob for supporting us. He's been a great supporter of the Wild Sheep Foundation, and just a really reputable outfitter, and tons of respect. So there's still a few tickets left on our WSR for the Desert Bighorn. I think we're about that 3/4 mark sold out. So it will sell out if you're thinking about getting some tickets. And again, those tag prices went up this year with him winning that award, right? People are going to be wanting those tags even more so now that he's won that award and got the, he's always had that reputation, but now he's got the award to back him up, right? So.
Oh, absolutely. And they always put down some big big sheep. Like that's if you want a shot at a book desert ram, there's the guys to go with. So yeah, as Kyle said, we're 3/4 sold out, and we don't expect that to last to the draw date like any of our other raffles. So yeah, now's your chance to hunt with an award-winning sheep hunter.
Cool. So this is episode 58. We're with Dr. Clayton Lamb. Clayton, this is a great podcast. I was just mesmerized that, I listened to him on the Hunter Conservationist podcast a while back and talking about grizzly bears, and I learned so much. I was just the grizzly bear ecology and how they function in the wild and the importance of habitat. And it just was fascinating to me, and he didn't disappoint. So we really dive into the caribou issue here, and just some, science at its finest, right? Hearing it from, a guy that's just talking about science. He really delves into the issue and why it's important. We talk about caribou, and then we get on Region 4, and we talk lots about bighorns in Region 4. We talk about this LEH issue that we've been dealing with the Wild Sheep Society of BC, and our members have weighed in and why we're raising concerns about, the LEH lever and nothing else being pulled. And we talk about building a bridge. And so it's really interesting. So, when you listen to this podcast, 58, do us a favor, get back to us. And, Clayton talks about, a wildlife overpass and the benefits. They lost 15 sheep this year. I think he figured it was maybe a little bit less than that, but they know of about 15 bighorn sheep that were killed or possibly died due to wildlife collisions with cars. So let us know what you think. We're pretty concerned about this. We want to see wildlife populations, especially bighorn sheep, restored in the Kootenays. And, we're pulling this LEH lever, which Clayton talks about. He says, the Bighorn Management Plan says that that's not going to fix the issue, right? And so, again, here we are, a single lever and nothing else being done. Let us know. Let us know what you think. Should we be advocating for wildlife overpasses so that these sheep can cross the highway safely? And that's a really classic example where he says it will actually work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also important to note that Clayton is a longtime hunter. He's not just speaking from the scientific view of hunting is bad. He will look at it holistically, objectively, and we get into that a little bit there as he speaks about wolves and caribou, and he actually specialized in grizzly bears for a long part of his career. So, yeah, he's definitely on our side, and everything he speaks about is 100% objective. So, I really enjoyed this episode and getting to chat with him again.
Cool. So email to communications@wildsheepsociety.com. Let us know. We have the winner of the Melligator answer from last episode with Laura. We'll be sending out some swag to the winner there.
If you looked up the words conservation superhero in the dictionary, you would see a picture of our friend Omer from Precision Optics. A tireless donor and supporter of all things wild sheep, Precision Optics, located in Quesnel, British Columbia, truly stands alone in the high alpine. From optics to rifles to outdoor gear and a knowledge that cannot be surpassed, toss in that killer smile and you have a total conservation package. Precision Optics, we are truly thankful for the support you show us every step of the way. Find them online at precisionoptics.net or in Aroma Foods, located just off Highway 97 in Quesnel, BC.
Good morning, Clayton. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really stoked. So before we got going here, you said you're coming to us from the Kootenays?
Yeah, I'm in Jaffrey, BC, nested in the Kootenays here. It's a snowy, wintry day, but pleased to be talking to you guys.
Awesome. Appreciate it. So you've been doing a ton of great work across the landscape. As I mentioned to you, I listened to you on the Hunter Conservationist podcast. Great article there about the work you're doing with grizzly bear. And it was really fascinating. I learned so much about grizzlies. I had no idea about. Just there's so much unknowns for me and I think a lot of people too. So really appreciate and I guess that was your PhD study was on grizzly bears. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did a PhD on kind of grizzly bear ecology and the challenges to coexisting with them across sort of Western North America, and obviously focusing on the hub of where grizzly bears are in British Columbia. So yeah, got to see a lot of cool places in BC that I actually hadn't seen even while out hunting. Places like flying into the Skeena and the Stikine and some pretty cool places, pretty wild places.
Okay, so I'm going to go down a dirt road here, but did you have any close calls with grizzlies? Was there any like, holy crap, I'm in trouble here? Or any interesting stories around that, or was it pretty benign?
I mean, all of my work experiences have been all really safe and somewhat pretty casual. We have good veterinary oversight, and we have really good drug. And I mean, it's incredibly safe handling bears. All of my bad or challenging or stressful bear experiences have been out hunting or doing things like that, not while I have my work cap on. So when I was a kid hunting in the Granby there, kind of above Rock Creek, I was charged by a grizzly bear, and I grew up in Chilliwack, so in the Lower Mainland, and no grizzly bears, and not that grizzly savvy when I was a kid. And we got charged by this big bear that was standing right in front of our truck when we were coming back from a hike, and that certainly changed my tune. And I was then immediately thought that bears were out to get us, and they were the worst thing. And now, of course, after doing this for a long time, I have a bit different view after chasing bears around for the better part of a decade now.
Right on. So, okay, now that we're down the dirt road, I'll just keep going. But with regards to when you're out hunting on the landscape, if you're out there with a rifle, are you always carrying bear spray? Because there's the whole bear spray, no bear spray debate. I don't do it, but every time I don't do it, I'm like, damn, I wish I had bear spray.
I always have bear spray, and I really changed my opinion on it too as I started, working professionally, doing this, and always being in bear country and actively attracting bears to my location for a living. And a big one is I used to carry a Defender because that was sort of growing up in a hunting type community and up hunting moose in the north. It was always sort of said you had to have a Defender in your tent and keep that shotgun close. And so I wanted to have a Defender as I was working on these dangerous bears. And after a while, I noticed the Defender was always in my truck or leaning against a tree, or it was too heavy. And I basically never had it in my hand to actually do any good. So, I obviously, when I'm hunting, I have a rifle, and then I do carry the bear spray because it's on my hip all the time, whereas my rifle is strapped in my back or it's somewhere else. So I think it's good. And, I always try to tell people that if there is a bear, say, charging across a football field from you, I would much prefer to have a firearm because you have time and distance, and it'd probably be more effective. But that's never going to happen to you. Like, you're never going to have that sort of an event where you have hundreds of meters to think and do something calmly. It's going to be a 10-foot stressful last second, like no idea it's coming type thing. And your gun's not that useful in that case. At least with my marksmanship, I'll say. I mean, others might be better, but the bear spray is pretty nice. It's like, just kind of a shotgun spray, and you can get that bear to turn around. In general, they don't want anything to do with you, right? Like, that's why people mostly get mauled and not killed, is because a bear comes in, gives you a couple of whacks, and it does incredible damage to us because we're sort of these thin-skinned, unfurred creatures. But the bear really just wants to tell you to get out of there, and that's why the bear turns tail and runs away. So, yeah, I carry bear spray, and I think it's a good sort of plan A in a lot of cases, and you have your firearm there if the situation is amenable to that.
Right on. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to segue there, but we were on the subject. So, we got more important things to talk about, but always an interesting debate. I always love, hearing those debates online about, and I'm with you. I totally think that we should do it, but I never do. So I gotta get better.
Get one.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. Ironically, I have one, but I got to do a better job of carrying it. So, okay, cool. So, Clayton, obviously, you've done a ton of work in academia. You've done a ton of studies, and I'm not going to do it justice trying to explain who you are. So, do you mind just giving us a little background on sort of your professional biography and maybe where you went to school, your studies, and what you've been involved in, and then we'll go on from there, please.
Yeah. So from the highest level, I'm a wildlife scientist, and I work on applied problems throughout Western North America. And I'd say my specialty is really working on those on the ground solutions, trying to make a difference on the land. And then the science aspect comes in trying to measure outcomes. So of course, there's no real point in investing money and effort and political and social capital and things that aren't working for wildlife. So that's kind of my role, is to help, along with, of course, folks like you guys, to stimulate changes on the ground and to, do things like prescribe burns and conflict mitigation and, differing levels of predator control at times for caribou. And then my job is to measure, is that working? Is that providing the benefits to wildlife that we expect? I mean, I think there's a sense in BC that hunters are pretty frustrated that a lot of things aren't happening. We're kind of watching wildlife decline and the landscape change, and wildlife sort of in the back seat. And when we do get something done and we can, get the political will to make change, I'm sort of there to make sure that what we do get done is going to work and provide the benefits to wildlife that we expect and we hope. So that's sort of my job, and I do that in a number of places and a number of species and sort of systems. So a big one is in the Elk Valley here in the East Kootenays, working on grizzly bear conflicts and kind of coexistence. So the Elk Valley is a really unique place in that it has an abundance of grizzly bears. There's grizzly bears that walk by all of our houses all the time. I mean, we live right in grizzly bear country. It's a very productive landscape that has grizzly bears and people nested, right in the same valley. And of course, it's a pretty busy place. I mean, we have an incredible recreation destination. We have thousands of people mountain biking and hiking and floating the Elk River. And then we have resource extraction from 5 large open pit coal mines and logging. So it's a busy place. It's a tourist destination. It's an industry hub, and there's a railway and a highway going through. So it's a unique place to study wildlife, because it kind of has all those things that are likely pretty challenging for wildlife to navigate, but also has a pretty high abundance of wildlife, at least right now. So my job is to kind of understand what aspects of that are working for wildlife and what are not, and to make sure that we kind of safeguard the pretty special biodiversity we have in the Elk Valley, which if folks don't know, I mean, the Elk Valley has bighorn sheep, pretty abundant bighorn sheep populations, goats, elk, deer, grizzly bears. It has all the big species basically except caribou and bison. So it's one of the biodiversity hotspots in British Columbia. So that's kind of one of the hubs where I work on grizzly bears, but a number of other species, including bighorn sheep ecology, elk migrations, and especially focusing on reducing roadkill. So kind of looking at those transportation corridors and looking at how we can basically make that landscape work better for people and wildlife, which is, I think, an important thing that we should talk about, kind of those win-win situations where we can make people and wildlife safer. And then I'd say the other component of my work is caribou ecology. So kind of zooming up to the north in sort of central BC in the Central Rockies, I work on recovering caribou populations with West Moberly First Nations and Soto First Nations, which is a pretty exciting project. It's one of the only places where caribou have almost been extirpated. So there was about 36 caribou there in 2013, and through some really effective and courageous leadership from West Moberly and Soto First Nations, they've almost tripled that caribou herd. So, when we think of caribou in BC and Western North America, it's kind of this really unfortunate, every couple of years there's another herd that's extirpated, and this herd, which is called the Klinziza, this would have been one of those, news stories that kind of gets lost in the background, another sort of failure on the land, but not accepting that fate. These nations really turn these caribou around through reductions in predator abundance and then maternal penning. So bringing those females in and looking after their young for a short period. So that's what I do. Those two spots are kind of the main focus of my work.
Cool. There's a lot to jump into there. But we're on the caribou subject now, so let's just go there. So, the caribou thing is so divisive, right? We've seen all these, there's obviously a lawsuit provincially against predator management. we've got an iconic species like caribou, on the threat of extirpation. And then we've got, wolf populations are strong in British Columbia. They have a very high fecundity. They're high reproductive rate. I've heard kind of the advocates for the lawsuit and ending predator management to say that, well, caribou are evolutionary. They're going to die. They're basically dumb animals, and just let nature take its course. I struggle with that. Can you kind of come at us from the science angle on how you guys approach this? There's the argument that, caribou or wolf management, you got to keep killing them. So, it doesn't really make sense. It's really expensive. And so, it's a really complex issue, and I know we're not going to do it justice in 10 minutes, but, kind of coming from your experience on the ground there and being involved in this, kind of give us an overview on it and your guys' approach to it. And, it's cool. We've seen this population triple. Obviously a very small population. There's a lot more work to be done, but is the juice worth the squeeze? That's, obviously our listeners, most of them believe that. I believe it, but, we get the other side of it. So I'd like to hear your perspective kind of from the science end of things, if you could, for us, Clayton.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, it's obviously a very complicated and sticky issue and charged from many sides. From the wolf side, I'd say that it's one of those things where there's folks that their opinions and views span a pretty broad gradient, and I'd say that folks on either end of the spectrum are often, they do a bit of harm to the greater good of those caribou, in that, folks that think that every wolf should die. I don't really think that's the kind of thing that, science would support, or, and generally kind of or at least my values as a person of British Columbia and a hunter. But, then of course the folks that think that every single wolf should live and they should proliferate across the landscape, that also creates unique challenges for folks, like ranchers, and for, of course, these caribou, which, I think, as we all know, is not the caribou or the wolves' fault. Really, the challenge with caribou is that we've changed these landscapes so dramatically because of basically industrialization of extraction on the landscape, and especially in the Kootenay, it's not unlike the Elk Valley in that it has sort of the perfect storm of problems. So basically, the Williston Reservoir cut off migration for these caribou on two sides, so on the west and the northern side. So the arm of the Williston comes around to the north, and the main Williston's on the west side. So that was kind of the first, or one of the many first cuts for these caribou in the 60s when that was flooded. Elders basically watched caribou try to go across the dam, which was now flooded, and fall through the ice and die as they tried to do their migration. And then, logging and oil and gas and just a lot of changes on the landscape have changed the predator-prey dynamics in such a major way on these landscapes. And basically logging and the linear features that come with that, roads and then oil and gas exploration, basically create a situation where wolves can move faster and more efficiently across the landscape, and it creates better food for deer and moose and elk, and that brings in more wolves. So the basic story is that these caribou used to live in fairly unproductive, low quality from a deer or elk's perspective habitats, and there was few predators, and that's how they made their living. And that is kind of why folks think they're dumb, is because they're sort of these sort of lovely creatures that are a bit predator naive, because they lived in sort of this low productivity landscape where they didn't have to run from predators all the time. They're not like elk out on the front range of Yellowstone that are, living with wolves all day long. So, that's sort of where the balance got disrupted. And then the question is whether it's our role as humans to sort of rejig that balance, especially given that, we could try to repair that landscape, but that is going to take an incredible amount of time. You could regrow those trees and fix those roadways, but that's going to take 30 to 80 years to turn that back into older growth forests. So that's sort of where this predator management thing comes in, and really it's an issue that there are the wolf density is too high in these caribou ranges to sustain these caribou populations, and the wolves aren't even really targeting the caribou per se. The wolves are there for other reasons to eat the high abundance of deer and moose and elk, and they basically just bump into these caribou and eat them sort of on the side opportunistically. And even that predation rate basically is unsustainable for these caribou populations. And we do see pretty strong evidence that when you reduce the wolf numbers, these caribou populations grow. They're definitely limited by wolf predation. But I think there's two things. We always have to be clear that this, as I said before, this is not a wolf or a caribou issue per se. It's a landscape issue. It's a habitat disturbance caused by us issue. So that's the root of the issue that we really have to keep our eyes on. And then I think the duration is of the predator control is what really starts to bother folks. And I think the way that I see it professionally is basically, if we're doing predator control and there's not plans to restore that habitat, at some point it becomes also sort of unviable. It does become just a short-term fix that is actually forever, which I don't think is very viable or supported by British Columbians. So I think the way to do it is the goal of the predator reductions or other things like maternal penning is to give these caribou a bridge until they can basically start to sustain themselves on a recovered landscape, which means that you have to very aggressively start recovering habitat and changing our fundamental relationship with how we manage those ranges. So it's a successful way to bridge those caribou. There's no question. And if we don't, those populations, a lot of them will go to zero. We will lose those caribou, but it's not really one or the other, predator control or habitat restoration. They really have to be coupled, or we are sort of wasting our time as well.
Yeah, I'm up in Prince George, and even as short as 3 years ago, I'd go out for a hunt and see wolf sign, wolf tracks everywhere, no moose. And the last couple of years, all I am seeing now is moose and wolf reduction. It's you're seeing it within 1-2 years of these measures being taken. It's great. We're starting to see that balance come back. But as you said, we can't do one without the other. I've always equated it to somebody's got a gaping wound and you're holding pressure on there while somebody tries to stitch that and stop the bleeding, right? That's what we're doing now with this. We want that wound to close, and we have to work together with a team to get it there. And I'm seeing firsthand results of it. Like we're seeing moose in numbers that you didn't normally see them. Like even coming back from back east, about an hour east of Prince George the other day, we saw 3 moose on the side of the road in 30-40K. That's unheard of. It's great, and the results are working. And as you said, it's balance, and we need to get that balance. And as a hunter and a trapper, I don't want to see wolves extinct. No way. They're amazing creatures, but we do need to get those numbers right.
Yeah.
So Clayton, I got a question for you from evolutionary perspective. Obviously, animals change. It takes time. It takes years. Nothing happens quickly. So obviously, there's the habitat piece. There's no question about that. But I think it was you that shared this with me that, grizzly bears used to be on the prairies. They were abundant on the prairies. And then because of, overly hunting and pressure by, First Nations, and then eventually the white men, and eventually now they're mountain animals, right? We don't see them on the prairies anymore. From an evolutionary perspective, will that help happen with caribou over a few decades? Will we see them changing and adapting to wolves and being able to self-sustain if we can get them there? Or is it one of those things that, no, habitat's the only solution in this case? Or, with the new landscape, can they survive in this with time and adaptation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if there was some sort of adaptive variation that, there was this caribou out there that, figured out how to avoid wolves and live up at high elevation. I mean, in theory, then yes, I mean, that caribou would do better, survive better, have more young. And if that was a heritable gene, it would create more of those caribou. I think the chance of that happening is so low because evolution happens on such a long time scale. You have to have that, perfect caribou there to sort of survive and spread those genes. And whether we have that sort of heritable gene and heritable caribou sitting there waiting for us is unknown. And these caribou, I mean, because they get so small, they also die by the craziest things. Like they die in avalanches. Like 7 go down in an avalanche, which of course, of course there could be selected for this cautious caribou that avoids avalanche terrain. But I mean, you just never know when you're going to lose one of these things either. And so I don't think that's unlikely to save us in this situation. Unfortunately, I think.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So, so the work's being done on the ground. You've been involved in it. What's going to take on the habitat piece then? Like, and I know this is a drum we beat, and it's going to come down to money and restricting industry and a whole bunch of other things. So, is this attainable, or are we? What does that look like from your perspective? And I'm not trying to throw any government under the bus. It just simply, can we do this, and what's it going to take?
Yeah, let me answer that in a second. I also want to speak to Steve's point about the moose increases, and I think that's such a good point, and it reminds me how the way we manage wildlife is this sort of unidimensional like lever, and it reminds me that the pendulum is always swinging one way or the other, and I could see a future not too far from now where that becomes a problem, right? Where there's so many moose that then ICBC has a problem with collisions, or those moose start to eat themselves out of house and home because they're not predator regulated, and then the range is depleted for moose for some time. And so I do think that's where we as sort of Western scientists and as sort of Western management agencies, we often fail sort of the land and these wildlife in pulling one single lever and sort of tuning the dial in one dimension. And there's some real risks there, especially because of the basically with wolf reductions right now. As you say, there's that lawsuit, and it could work for those moose for some time. And it'd be great if hunters can go out and harvest those moose, and it might work for some time. But you could also imagine a situation where if moose density becomes 5 times greater than it was, and all of a sudden that lawsuit is successful, and the province of BC can no longer reduce wolf density, those wolves will come back in droves to this hyper abundance of moose, and that will spell disaster for those caribou. So, it's sort of folks that I work with up in the Peace there, Indigenous land stewards are always reminding us that we need to think of these things more holistically and not pull one lever at a time. And I think, I think we'll see something like that happen here, in that it could be non-ideal if we don't sort of think of the consequences of those high densities of moose as well, even though it's good right now for us. And about the habitat restoration, I mean, I think the majority of the work is focused on, 2 things. I guess we need to make sure that when we're investing money in habitat restoration, it's not one of these shell games where, say, you spend $1 million in one drainage to make it caribou habitat, but simultaneously the neighboring drainage, which was wild, is being logged. So that is essentially just a waste of time, because you spent $1 million to get right back where you were, and whether the volume of timber that came out of the neighboring drainage was even worth that investment is sometimes uncertain. So that's a big one, and that is a challenge, as you can imagine. That has real consequences for the harvestable land base of timber and for people and communities and jobs. And one thing I'd point out that is constantly conflated is sort of the downturn in the abundance of available wood and caribou conservation. And one thing that we know, even without caribou, is that the availability of wood in BC, of standing timber, is going down through time. So we basically cut all of the available old growth, and now we're kind of in this system where we're on this sort of tree farm system now. There's not just this standing crop of 100 to 500-year-old trees that we can just go cut. Now we have to wait for them to regrow in pretty well every part of the province, except a few percent where it is old growth. So that means now we are on this kind of fixed cap of what we can cut, where it was less capped when we were still cutting old growth. And then this huge cut of pine beetle, which was above what is sustainable. Of course, if we can't keep that going, we were basically liquidating that pine beetle wood while it was available. But we created this this idea that was how we could cut for a long time. And basically, with no caribou conservation, we knew that the availability of timber was going to decline dramatically in BC, and mills were going to close. And so there was a future of some degree of sunsetting for that forestry industry. But then, of course, I do feel like caribou kind of gets thrown under the bus and be like, this is all because of the caribou, instead of the honest conversations that we knew this was coming for a long time. So yeah, that's just sort of the first thing to point that out. And then really the focus of restoration is on the roads in a lot of ways. It's not very economical to try to speed up a clear-cut regrowing. There's already legal mandates to plant clear cuts, so they are restored. I mean, forestry in BC is a sustainable, somewhat green industry that, of course, is not that is replaceable. So that's already happening. It's restored all the time, and then unrestored. Of course, that's sort of the cycle. But unrestoring it through clear cutting would not work that well for caribou. But the focus is on the roads and those linear features and well paths, and that basically is a pretty intensive job, because it requires an excavator to rip up pretty hard packed and well-made roads, which those roads, if folks don't know, we, the people of BC, own all or most of the forestry roads in British Columbia. Like, we pay for them. So they are subsidized roads. They're not owned by the forestry company. We as taxpayers pay for those roads. And so in some ways, we both we own some of the access that they provide, but also if folks are not keen on the level of road densities and what they do for negative consequences to wildlife, I mean, people should speak up and talk to the government about that, because we are actively subsidizing those roads all the time. So that's the focus of the restoration, is to reduce the road density and then let those clear cuts basically regrow on their own. But it's a long time, as you can imagine. And it would be a long time if we restored everything today. Like, if we could get rid of all those roads. But in reality, we're not actually even restoring that many kilometers of roads a year. We're not getting that serious about habitat restoration for caribou in BC yet. So the landscape of having like this restored caribou habitat is a long ways out, if we're being honest.
We got this scenario where, okay, the industry is a tough one, right? You've got a viable industry in BC. They're making money. There's, people's food is on the table, and if you're going to take their food away from the table, it's not good for votes. It's not good for the families. So I get that argument, but this road restoration business, that's something we can do. And there are abandoned areas in oil and gas and the logging industry. So why aren't we investing that money? Why is the government reticent to do that? I'm a little bit. Is it too expensive? They're not willing to put the effort in. I'm curious about that. And then the other side of it is, isn't that something you can put back on the industry? Shouldn't the industry be a bit more accountable there? And the government, you said we own those roads. Well, we're allowing someone to put those roads in and profit off them. Should they not be more accountable in terms of? And I know this is a huge discussion, and we're not going to solve the road issue today. But why aren't we doing more? Why isn't the government more proactive with regards to this?
I guess I don't know. Not a very satisfying answer, but it's kind of one of these status quo type biases that it's the way we've always done it, and changing policy is hard. And it's hard in that an entire forestry sector, which is massive in British Columbia, has been set up with these conditions and these levels of subsidy that would require a change in business and operations and models. And of course, that's when, those pretty powerful companies get a hold of the upper level politicians, and these things kind of stop. And it's not my area of expertise to say whether it could be viable if, they did restore all those roads. I mean, that's sort of a business decision that is a bit outside my zone. But I do know that that level of roads is not working for wildlife in British Columbia. And we're going to have to deal with that at some point. And a big one is that a lot of these rules and regulations and policies that we have trouble with today were actually brought in it with good intentions at one time. I mean, British Columbia was a big, expansive place that was really hard to access. I mean, even today with our 1 million kilometers of road, which would basically wrap around the earth 36 times, it still seems like it's hard to get into places. I mean, you hunt sheep up in the north, you hunt stone sheep, you can walk for like 200 kilometers without touching a road between the two highways. I mean, it's still a lot of wild place. But now, because of all of that roading, which was, the goal was to open up BC and create, access to economically viable resources. And that was in the interest of the settlers, at least, of British Columbia. It was probably a beneficial policy for the folks that made that policy early in the days when access was so limiting. But, now where we have these situations where there's basically a road going up one side of a drainage and a second one going down the other side, and parallel roads, and it's just chaos and too many roads. We're kind of at this tipping point where they're not really serving us for greatly beneficial access per se in a lot of places. And the detriment of that degree of road density, we're really starting to feel it on the wildlife population. So that's kind of where we need to think about novel ways to address this issue. And even just last week, a paper came out from government scientists saying that there was too many roads in caribou habitat, and they were the main issue, and they were recommending no more roading. And of course, I think a better answer is those roads need to be reduced. I mean, they don't want them, they could say don't make it worse, but it's pretty clear that the current level of roads is not working for those caribou. So we actually have to actively reduce them. But, even from within government, they're kind of saying like, this is not working. So I do think we're at a period of change, but the Forest and Range Practice Act, FERPA, they call it, was just sort of renegotiated, and it didn't really come back with really strong road language. There's some better work on restoration, but it's not a clear mechanism that roads will be restored. So I don't think we're quite there.
So that's the interesting thing. We've got caribou species at risk now, and the federal government's involved. Provincially, the government wasn't doing what they needed to manage the species, so federally they've stepped in now. So, is that something, they've identified the predator piece and they're working on that, but is that something where they step in and say, okay, well, the federal government starts mandating some of these road restoration projects and that sort of stuff, but obviously they're not going there just yet. So,
and I think that might happen. I mean, caribou are really unique in that they are, they're a threatened species under the Species at Risk Act, but they're endangered under COSEWIC, which is basically this body that recommends what should be listed or not. So there's kind of this gap in even listing them as endangered, because that would probably be not very convenient for Canada. But, I do think that because they are listed on the Species at Risk Act, there are actual things that have to happen legally. It's unlike, say, a declining bighorn sheep population, where we as the science community and as hunters can say, this is not acceptable, we don't like this. And folks can do something about it in government or not. They're not necessarily legally mandated, whereas it is different with caribou. I mean, they have legal protection, and their habitat has legal protection. So, I do think that we'll start heading that way. It's certainly a well-studied and well-documented issue. It's not as if, Sarah, the Species at Risk Act has saved these caribou either, though, right? Like even under this federal legislation, they are being extirpated annually. So it really speaks to the role that people have, and groups like Wild Sheep Society and just people that care about the land. I mean, if the people of BC told politicians that they're upset about the road density would be changed, but it's just not a hot button item for people, as you can imagine it. I think I probably think about it as much as, entire cities of people elsewhere in the province. So, basically it's one of these issues that we can't really rely on, even though my job is to produce evidence and science, we can't always rely on the best available science and evidence to actually make things happen. I mean, we know what to do in a lot of wildlife issues, but there's just not always political will because, and for very real reasons, that some of these things have compromises. They're not win-win situations, and there's sort of losers in some of these situations, and those folks might be people's jobs or tourism or other things that basically end up being less valued than what you want done. And so, or more valued than what you want done, and it just doesn't get done. So that is really where the voice of organized groups like you guys and lots of folks that speak for wildlife actually makes a real difference. I mean, I kind of sit on the create evidence side, and there's a lot of really skilled and keen biologists that sit on the government side, and there's a lot of times where we're speaking the same language, but the sort of politicians are then at another level, and they need to say, okay, it's time to act. And then all of us go to work and work together. But the system is not really set up to work from me straight to government to an action. Even though, when I did my undergrad, they teach you this really smooth, clean cycle of how you do science and it changes the world. And that is unfortunately not how it works. I mean, we see that with COVID and all kinds of aspects of our life that there's a lot of other dimensions that change whether things happen or not.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. You shut down an industry or severely impact an industry where people's livelihoods at stake. It's going to have a significant impact on your votes when it comes to the next election. So yeah, it's very clear where it's job preservation too with regards to our political community. They don't always do what's best for us as a community collectively. They might they're looking at it in a much different lens than just wildlife. So
we've said that very thing before though, Kyle, that it as Clayton just touched on.
One second, I just got somebody at the door. 1 second.
Yeah. The voice of the people can enact positive change, right? And we see it when it comes to wildlife, and Clayton says it can happen when it comes to road management as well, right? We speak up, we get loud enough, things can change. And elected officials, ultimately, we're the ones that hire them and fire them. And we get loud enough, things will change. And it's good to hear it from the scientific community as well, not just people like me who bitch and complain, right?
An example, it's not that serving to me as somebody that produces information, but I'll give you an example where all of these reports and meetings don't go a long ways, and the BC's interested in cumulative effects. So basically, all the different things that come together that create problems on the land. Like we can't just think about roads, or we can't just think about climate change, or it's all of these things that create the problem. Death by 1,000 cuts, and I think it's a useful way to think about challenges in BC. And to pilot it, they started in the Elk Valley, and obviously a place near and dear to my heart. But as I tried to impress upon you earlier, it's a pretty interesting place with a lot of biodiversity and a lot of challenges. So the whole BC cumulative effects management framework was piloted in the Elk Valley, and through a number of different stakeholders and these fancy modeling techniques and industry partners and Indigenous partners and experts, we spent years developing this framework. And there was a number of they're called valued components. So they're basically the things that you care about, and then you see what changes them and what we should be looking forward to make them better. So the valued components were bighorn sheep, of course, West Slope cutthroat trout, grizzly bears, and old growth forests. So, a pretty dynamic and comprehensive group of species and indicators that represent what's special in the valley. And the number one recommendation from that was to reduce road density. So this came out maybe in 2019, and it's been endorsed by a number of groups, including Ktunaxa First Nation, and government partners were a part of it. And it was kind of like, okay, we all sat in these, hundreds of hours of meetings and this, pretty well-funded project. But, here we are in 2022, and we don't have drastically fewer roads, if any, in the Elk Valley after all of that process. I mean, their government is slowly working on reducing some roads. We're talking about like 15 to 20 kilometers a year, and it's mostly roads that nobody's driving. So whether that has an effect on wildlife is kind of unknown. They might have been wildlife habitat for all we know, because they're grass and nobody's driving them, and it might be a great spot for a elk to walk down. And the roads that are going to have an effect are the ones that people are driving on and are hard to close, to be fair to the government, that the people get quite upset because they've accessed every drainage at some point in their life, and some drainages are really important to people. Their grandpa took them up there, and they're culturally important. So, we've done all that science and we did all these reports, and nothing drastic is changing. And it's because a lot of people don't want to see the access reduced on the landscape. So another example of where the science and all the sort of efforts don't go all that far when the people don't really want to see it happen. And I think the pendulum would swing the other way. Like, if we can help the public and the vocal folks understand why this would be important, and they said, let's do this, it would get done. So, again, there's sort of this middle group that does sort of give the yay or nay at times on what's viable and what should be done on the landscape. And that's sometimes out of my and government biologist control.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Clayton. And let's pivot to that now. Let's talk about bighorns and the Kootenays. And for our members and listeners, we had this issue around Region 4 LEH, and the government came out and said, okay. So first of all, a little bit of backstory there. There was a bighorn management plan that was conducted recently. It was very comprehensive, a multi-faceted document, 90 plus pages, really well done, that laid out all these issues in the Kootenays in Region 4 for bighorn sheep. And so now pivot to 2021, and the government says, okay, there's dwindling bighorn sheep populations, and we're going to put sheep on LEH because we think if we reduce numbers, which we didn't, argue with them, like, okay, if we're harvesting too many sheep, that's an issue. Fair enough. But the issue that we had was it came to this single lever thing where it was like, okay, we've got an issue and we're just going to stop or reduce hunting and not do anything else. So, one of the things that we really advocate, we obviously want to do what's right for the resource. So that's where, if there's a compelling argument for LEH, okay, that's legitimate. That's good enough. But, what are we going to do to restore these animals, right? And, one of the questions I asked the regional biologists and, the government was, if we just stop hunting altogether, or, we put them on LEH, whatever the case may be, is this going to fix wild sheep in the Kootenays? And the answer was, well, probably not. So, here we are back to looking at LEH, and there's no other solution. So, I guess let's talk about Region 4 and what can we do there? What's, access management, roads, that's the biggest one I think you mentioned. But what do we really need to be doing there? What's the real issue that we need to be looking at?
I think that all the evidence points towards the Region 4 bighorn sheep. Their habitat is declining for a number of reasons. The main ones are a lack of fire on the landscape, maintaining fire on the landscape, and overgrazing, especially in the Elk Valley, kind of in the 80s and 90s, by a pretty abundant population of elk and sheep. So those high elevation grasslands are degraded, and they're not being recovered because there's no fire on the landscape. So there's no expansion of the habitat and no recovery of the habitat. And at least in the Elk Valley, there's, of course, another challenge in that some of those high elevation grasslands are under threat from mountaintop removal mining. And that is both sort of a challenge for those sheep, and then does provide some habitat at times during some portions of the year that are outside the winter as well. But I think we know what we need to do for those sheep. I mean, increasing the role of fire on a landscape would do a lot for those sheep, and especially given that the places we want to burn are often above sort of the marketable timber line and accessible timber line as well. And then for some of these sheep, collisions with vehicles is a big source of mortality. Sheep, as I think we all know, are this weird species that are this a symbol of wilderness and a monarch of the wild. And then in the same breath, they're sort of like garbage bears at times. I deal with this with grizzly bears too, where they're this really wild, symbolic species, but then they're like in your backyard chewing on your bird feeder, and it's like, is this the same thing that we, that is the symbol of wild? And sheep are kind of like that. I mean, they're standing on top of an excavator on site on a coal mine with not a shred of grass around. It's like, don't you have any dignity? Like, you should be up in the hills, So they're this unique creature that then also stands in the middle of a highway and licks salt off the highway and lives in town and on golf courses, which a goat would never do. I mean, we have very few sort of those domestic habituated goats. There's small examples where they'll, goats will lick urine around a campsite or something, but we really don't see goats habituating to people like we see sheep. And of course, because the goat is a nobler species, which I would never say to you guys. But the challenge with those sheep is that they are around people a lot, and that does create some pretty unique challenges, especially in the winter range. So Radium's a good example. There's a herd right now of about 140 sheep there that are experiencing upwards of 10% mortality just from collisions alone, which is completely unsustainable for those sheep. And then sheep are also pretty susceptible to disease, as we know, both from domestic sheep and then just naturally. My girlfriend is a vet, and she was always taught in vet school that once domestic sheep get sick, I mean, it's a big job to bring them back. They like to sort of just flip over, and so they are a sensitive species when they get sick and can have incredibly huge die-off. So, as I say, we know what we need to do for these sheep. We need to improve their habitat and not let it continually degrade. I mean, we're not looking for expansion of habitat. We're not trying to, change what was already there. I think we're just trying to make sure that we don't lose what was once great bighorn habitat in the Kootenays. And the report that you spoke to, it says all these things right in the executive summary. It's the Kootenay management plan, and it says that the things that are affecting these sheep are habitat loss, collisions, and disease. And then at the end of the executive summary, it says hunting is not expected to do, or I guess hunting regulations is not expected to increase the viability of these populations. And so I think that kind of speaks for itself, that that's not what's going to save these sheep.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the challenging part for us. So, but when we talk to wildlife managers, they say to us, well, there's nothing, we have one lever we can pull. And as a manager, right? So, this highway mortality issue is a MODI issue, right? It's a different ministry. Disease is a different ministry. Habitat loss is industry. It's another industry. So, and I guess that's where it comes back to that political will. You really have to influence it at a kind of at the political level to get provincial buy-in to actually have the will to change these other ministries to address these issues. Because FLNRO doesn't really have the capacity to look after the wildlife, right?
You're exactly right. It's sort of this the two groups pointing at each other, like, these are your sheep, but this is your highway, and it's like, and they both just point at each other, and then it's hard to know whose jurisdiction it is. And I think, I mean, the biologists aren't wrong in that the way the system is set up is that's one of the only levers they have. And the folks that look after wildlife in BC from the FLNRO side, I mean, these are folks that really care about wildlife and got into it because they want to do a good thing and look after wildlife in BC. And I think a lot of them are frustrated with the system that they're in as well, that they can't do more, that they don't have the ability to just, sign an order and build an overpass, or, just put a polygon on the landscape and next year it gets burned. I mean, everything's so siloed in that, they'd have to work with the highway ministry to do that. And there's other priorities, and they'd have to work with range and agriculture and all these different groups that don't always have sheep or bears or caribou at the front of their mind. And so it is kind of a challenge with the system that we have set up. And I think it always comes back to the people, that if the people care about wildlife and they made it known, then that would raise to a higher priority.
Well, it's interesting. CBC did an article recently, and you were featured in it, and we're talking about this mortality issue on the highway. If we could pull it off and we built a wildlife overpass, is that going to be is that going to solve a lot of problems if we put a single overpass in, or is it do we need multiple overpasses? What does it look like? We see in other jurisdictions where it's been pretty successful. Is that a solution in the Kootenay forest that would actually work?
I think in Radium especially, it's a viable solution, because the area that those sheep are getting hit is an incredibly small area. It's a little collision hotspot. It's basically the hill entering Radium from the south, and it's a couple kilometer stretch that we'd sort of need to fence off and build an overpass. I mean, you could theoretically just fence it, but without the overpass, we don't want to cut off the connectivity of those sheep, and they'd probably just find a way into that fence if we excluded them solely from it. So what we'd want to do is fence it, secure those ends, and provide jump outs. So basically there's ways that if they did get inside the fence, they can jump out through a one directional kind of jump, and then build an overpass. And I mean, we build infrastructure across Western North America at a high rate. I mean, we pour a lot of concrete on this side of the world, on this continent. And I mean, we should start pouring it for wildlife, especially given the degree to which we take habitat away doing that. And I think the work from Banff and actually a lot of the Western states now really show us that overpasses and fencing work. They reduce wildlife collisions over 85% and can be over 95% for ungulates, so like your deer and your elk and your sheep. And the ones that do get through are like coyotes and things that still, you can never keep them out. They're a wily, pretty smart creature. But the animals that we're thinking about, the ungulates, they can't get into that fence, and they go over the overpasses and underpasses and learn to use that landscape. And these animals are well tuned to doing that. I mean, I hear folks they basically get concerned about, say, reducing the connectivity in some ways, because now the animals can't freely cross. But at least here in the Rockies, I mean, I think about the giant walls of rock that we have in every direction, and these little passes that go through between drainages. I mean, these animals, they're used to that. They're used to 5-10 kilometer stretches that are unpassable, and then they go through a narrow mountain pass that has a trail beat into it over decades. And in this case, we don't really want crossings to be more than a kilometer or two from one another. We want one every couple kilometers. But on the Radium side, I think we could just do a couple kilometers of fencing and an overpass and get those sheep to be able to move freely around their winter range. So that's one of the features of where the highway is it cuts right through a grassland that's a steep, low elevation winter range for those sheep. So kind of want to connect both sides, allow them access to water and then their higher elevation ranges, and keep them off the highway and separate them from the vehicles, and try to find a situation where it's obviously not good for these sheep to be hit, but it's not good for people either. I mean, damage to your grill and your radiator and upsetting your trip is that's not helping people and the flow of goods either. So I do think that this sort of road ecology work is poised to create these win-win situations where governments might be keen to invest because it does good things for wildlife and for people.
Interesting. Yeah. So my understanding, I think from that article, there was 15 bighorn sheep killed in 21 in that Radium section there. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think there was at least 13, and then there was a number that were hit and then were never recovered, and then there was another 4 or so that were killed by liver flukes. So again, one of these things where it's a cumulative effect and sort of death by 1,000 cuts. That anything north of 10 sheep dying in that herd is a lot of sheep in 140 sheep, and when we're seeing somewhat north of maybe 20 sheep killed a year, I mean that's a number of sheep that are dying. And given that the greatest fraction is because of collisions, it's certainly something we want to put our mind to solving. And as we talked about, it's something we've been thinking about for a long time. There was an article from 1993 in the Invermere paper, and it reads exactly like an article you could write today. It has a picture of sheep on the highway licking salt, and it says that these sheep are dying at high rates, and it's something we need to solve. And I mean, it's a bit discouraging, to be honest, that we're sort of, the wheel goes around and we're not making a lot of action. But I am encouraged that I think the role of Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure in conserving wildlife is increasing. I mean, I think the culture in the agency is certainly shifting their eye towards doing better by these wildlife, and I think we'll see something change there in the near future. I'm at least probably a lot more optimistic than the folks were in '93.
Yeah, so that's the thing we were talking about. That article was close to 30 years old. That I'm not sure if you shared it or whatever, but we've seen that article, and it's just incredible. 30 years later, and we lose 15 sheep in a year, or whatever the number, maybe 14 or whatever you mentioned. So it's significant, and it's really disheartening. And here we're faffing around with wildlife regulations, which we know is not going to solve the issue. And we're not even talking, well, we are talking today about it, but we're not talking enough about doing more on the landscape that we actually know could affect these sheep populations and help them, right?
Well, that's just it. I mean, there's almost as many sheep dying in that couple kilometers as in the entire Elk Valley harvest. And of course, the sheep that die on the highway also include ewes and pregnant animals and lambs, and then young rams. And so the actual per capita hit of those deaths are harder on the population than harvesting those mature rams that at least in BC with our full curl rule should have already done some substantial level of breeding, and there should be a lot of rams still on the landscape based on that rule. So yeah, I do find that frustrating that we turn our attention and our effort to something that is not really well supported by hunters and isn't well supported that it will help sheep, while on out the other side of our eye there's sheep dying, and we could do something to help them. And also a sheep dead on the highway is fundamentally wasted. I mean, it's not eaten. Nothing good comes from that sheep's death for people or for that sheep. I mean, that sheep is just sort of put into a gravel pit, basically, and somebody's radiator is blown out. And obviously, somebody hunting a sheep is a very different thing. Of course, a sheep still dies, so that's maybe not great for that sheep per se, but that is an experience for people, somebody that values being on the land. There might be you might be taking a kid out hunting, and it's time out on the land, connecting with it and understanding sheep, and maybe bringing some food home for your family and getting some exercise. So, I think it's obvious where we should be putting our attention. It's probably not at the full curl regulation, especially given that the report said that wasn't going to do very much for these sheep.
Yeah, very well said, Clayton. Really good points there, and really frustrating, and there's 100 things we can talk about today, and I think we'll probably end it there. And actually, we're going to get you back on the show because there's a whole bunch of other stuff I want to talk about, but I know it's going to be another half-hour discussion on this. So I think we end it there. And I think we got to ask ourselves, what can we really do to help these Region 4 sheep? Like, what's the real issue here? And what do we need to do as the Wild Sheep Society BC? And hearing from you, this is one of the issues. So is this something we need to push more and hold the government accountable to, and try and actually make some effective changes that are going to help these wild sheep, not just sort of Band-Aid that's not going to really it's not going to solve the problem, and it really, maybe stops the bleeding temporarily, but at the end of the day, it's not going to fix the issue. So I'm going to be respectful of your time today, Clayton, and I really appreciate you diving into this and for being so candid, right? Like, these are some pretty emotive issues and some challenging issues, and I love the way you're tackling them. So thank you very much for coming on today. And I'm hoping we can get back together, because there's a whole bunch of things I want to talk about, but I just know we can't cover them in a timely manner here today. So
sounds good. Well, thanks so much for having me. It was great chatting with you guys today.
Thank you.